Hello and welcome to Perfect AI Press Channel. This content is generated by AI, which extracts unbiased analytics from various valid YouTube news channels and major news agency websites. We spent the past week really digging into a huge pile of reports, both international and domestic. Think DW News, Al Jazeera, PBS, CNN, all covering this massive event, the No Kings protests.
Yeah, and it's definitely more than just another rally. The scale, the coordination, it's something else.
Exactly. And then you have the administration's response, which was, well, digitally very sophisticated. So that's what we're diving into. Our goal today for you is pretty clear. We're synthesizing these often conflicting reports. We want to get a handle on just how big this dissent really was.
Understand the grievances, right? What actually brought people out.
Precisely. What were those specific, maybe painful issues? And then how did the administration and its allies push back? We aim to give you that quick, thorough, unbiased picture you need to grasp this moment.
And if we think bigger picture, this really feels like a critical moment of popular resistance. There was that big demonstration back in June, remember?
I do.
But organizers are claiming this one was even larger. Some figures floating around. Potentially over 7 million Americans?
7 million? That's huge.
Potentially, yeah. According to one organizer cited by PBS, it could be the largest single day of protest in U.S. history. So this isn't just background noise, it's potentially a seismic event.
Okay, let's stick with that scale for a minute, because it's not just the number, 7 million, it's the where.
Right.
Sources are confirming protests happened in all 50 U.S. states. But, maybe even more impressive, reports say over 2,500 to 2,600 cities and towns.
Wow.
Yeah, so not just D.C., New York, Chicago, but small towns, suburbs, really everywhere.
And that geographical spread is, I think, essential. When you see numbers like that, millions participating, it suggests this cuts across those typical divides, urban, rural, red state, blue state.
It points to a kind of shared anxiety, maybe?
Yeah.
That's truly national.
I think so. It demonstrates something pretty widespread.
Okay, but if the core issue is U.S. governance, American civil liberties, why the international angle? We saw reports of big protests in Toronto, Berlin, London, Paris. What's going on there?
That's a great question. And it's fascinating, really. The global reaction seems to signal that the concern isn't just about specific U.S. policies.
It's broader.
Yeah, it's more about what the world sees as a potential authoritarian drift in a major democracy. Sources like Wyon and Reuters mention that international protesters were worried about democratic institutions globally. They see what's happening in the U.S. not just as a domestic issue, but maybe a worrying trend worldwide.
That's a heavy implication. Let's shift a bit to the atmosphere at these rallies. Millions protesting. You might expect tension, maybe clashes.
You might.
But reports, pretty much across the board, Reuters, Al Jazeera included, describe them as overwhelmingly peaceful, boisterous, orderly. Even words like joyful or carnival-like came up.
Yeah, and that contrast is interesting, isn't it? The really serious complaints versus this almost celebratory atmosphere in places. People in costumes, holding funny signs.
So's the thinking there.
Well, Al Jazeera suggested it might serve two purposes. One, obviously maintaining peace, which was critical with such huge crowds. But two, it pushes back against that narrative that the protesters are all angry extremists.
It kind of disarms that criticism.
Exactly. And it also speaks volumes about the organization behind it all.
Right. Let's talk about that organization. It sounds like it must have been incredibly coordinated.
It really was. Sources mention more than 300 grassroots groups working together, and this is key. The ACLU apparently trained tens of thousands of volunteers as marshals.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah, to keep the peace. They were that visible presence, making sure things stayed orderly, demonstrating that the movement itself was fundamentally civil, despite the anger and the huge numbers.
So, a festive mood, massive organization, but driven by pretty serious complaints. Okay, let's pivot to those core grievances. What actually brought maybe 7 million people out to say, no kings?
Well, the central message, no kings, is pretty clearly a rejection of what demonstrators see as President Trump's authoritarian tendencies, the expansion of executive power.
Acting like a monarch, not an elected official.
That's the core sentiment, yeah. DW and Wyon highlighted that protesters felt the president was operating outside the normal bounds, eroding those democratic checks and balances.
But it wasn't just abstract political science, right? People were reacting to specific, tangible actions.
No, absolutely. Very specific things. One huge one was the militarized immigration crackdown by IC.
What specifically about it?
Sources like DW and Forbes pointed to things like midnight raids, arrests happening without judicial warrants. And those really harrowing stories of children coming home from school to find their parents gone, detained.
Yeah, that's visceral.
It really is. That kind of enforcement, seen as lacking due process, maybe even cruel, that's powerful fuel for mobilization.
And that connects to the broader criticism about deploying law enforcement domestically, right?
Precisely. Taiwan Plus and PBS reported widespread anger about the deployment of National Guard troops and more federal law enforcement in U.S. cities. Protesters saw it as executive overreach, like the federal government stepping into local policing.
Raising constitutional alarms.
Big constitutional red flags, yeah. And digging deeper, it wasn't just about specific policies, it was more foundational.
Like what?
Fears about core principles, freedom of speech, the separation of powers, basic protections under the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. People felt these were genuinely under threat, being ignored.
And the frustration went even wider.
It did. It wasn't just civil liberties. People were also protesting policies on healthcare, education, national security, and what they saw as pressure on universities, the media, even law firms, institutions that might normally push back. Global news highlighted that feeling that mechanisms of dissent were being undermined.
Okay, so constitutional fears, policy failures, and then there's an economic dimension too. Senator Bernie Sanders framed no kings in terms of oligarchy.
Yeah, that connection is really important. Sanders specifically talked about the insatiable greed of tech billionaires he named Musk, Bezos, Zuckerberg.
Saying they've hijacked the system.
Exactly, hijacked the economy and the political system. So in this view, the authoritarian drift isn't just about one person. It's enabled by concentrated wealth, which fuels unchecked political power. It broadens no kings from just Trump to a critique of the whole structure.
So millions see the president as an authoritarian, maybe backed by big money. How did the administration, the folks actually in power, respond to this massive challenge?
Well, the response was fast and came on multiple fronts. You had President Trump just flatly saying, "I'm not a king."
Denying the label.
Right. But then there was the counterattack in the digital world, which was much more complex, maybe more insidious.
The AI videos, that feels like a new frontier in political fighting. WIN covered this quite a bit.
It's a huge shift, yeah. Trump and his allies use these AI-generated videos to basically mock and twist the king narrative. Trump posted an AI video of a jet labeled King Trump spraying mud on protesters.
Seriously?
Yeah, and AI images of himself dressed as a king looking sort of benevolent.
And Vice President Vance got in on it, too.
He did. VP J.D. Vance posted an AI video that was maybe even more pointed. It showed Trump putting on a crown while political opponents, like Nancy Pelosi, are shown kneeling before him.
Oh, wow. So it's not just dismissal, it's almost embracing the imagery.
It's a strange mix of mockery and maybe normalization, and definitely intimidation, visually showing opponents subjugated. It's powerful stuff.
So while that digital front was active, the verbal response from Republican leaders was pretty harsh, very unified.
Oh, yeah, completely unified, designed to just delegitimize the whole movement. House Speaker Mike Johnson, other allies, they immediately labeled the protests Hate America rallies.
Painting them as extremists, not concerned citizens.
Exactly the strategy. And they used really specific loaded terms to do it.
What kind of terms?
Reports from PBS and CNN noted they explicitly accused the protesters of bringing together, quote, the Marxists, the socialists, the Antifa advocates, the anarchists, and the pro-Hamas wing of the far-left Democrat Party.
That's quite a list, lumping millions under those labels.
Right. By doing that, they tried to justify basically ignoring or condemning the whole movement, regardless of the actual range of people involved.
But as our dive shows, that unified description just doesn't match the reality on the ground, does it?
No, it really falls apart when you look closer. Al Jazeera, for instance, pointed out how complex the coalition actually was. You had self-described never-Trump Republicans marching alongside groups calling for, radical wealth redistribution or an end to U.S. support for Israel.
So massive internal diversity, maybe even contradictions.
Definitely contradictions, and that highlights a really key internal division within the broader opposition.
You mean between the sort of democratic establishment and the grassroots?
Exactly that. The official opposition, like Democratic leaders, they tend to focus pretty narrowly on the authoritarianism issue. But the grassroots, they're bringing in a much wider, sometimes conflicting set of concerns: cost of living, healthcare, foreign policy, especially Gaza. That internal tension is a big deal for the movement's future.
Okay, let's connect this back to the immediate political context. These massive protests didn't happen in a vacuum, right? Washington was in turmoil.
No, the timing is really significant. This all went down during a 3-week government shutdown, and it followed those intense clashes over immigration enforcement. So the atmosphere was already incredibly tense.
Does the timing suggest anything about the movement's impact?
Well, one organizer, Robert Weissman from Public Citizen, argued that the huge turnout showed Trump's, quote, effort to intimidate is failing. His point was that seeing millions out there makes it easier for others to join in, showing people they aren't alone. It potentially emboldens future action.
Okay, now, for something that really puts this whole no kings idea into sharp focus, a kind of aha moment from the highest court in the land reported by CNN.
Yeah, this raises a really fundamental question. If the executive branch just decides to ignore the rules, what actually stops them? What power do the checks and balances really have?
And Justice Barrett spoke to this.
Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, yeah. She publicly talked about the court's inherent limitations. She pointed out that the Supreme Court lacks the power of the purse, it can't control government spending, and it lacks the power of the sword.
The power of the sword. That's striking language, straight out of the Federalist Papers almost. What's the implication of her saying that?
The implication is pretty profound. It means that, fundamentally, the court has limited ability to enforce its rulings if a president decides to just defy them. It's happened before in history, think Andrew Jackson.
So the courts can rule, but they can't force compliance on their own.
Exactly. Her admission really underscores that when those institutional checks feel weak, or maybe they're being deliberately bypassed by the executive, then popular action people in the streets becomes incredibly important.
So the No Kings movement is kind of stepping into that gap.
You could see it that way. Filling a space where the traditional power of the sword is seen as overreaching, making the voice of millions perhaps the last essential democratic safeguard.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this for the listener. We've looked at this huge, diverse, mostly peaceful movement. Its claim is defending democracy against authoritarianism.
And it was met with a really aggressive counter-narrative, digitally sophisticated, politically unified, framing the whole thing as extremist, anti-American.
So what's the key takeaway here?
I think the main takeaway is that these deep anxieties about democratic norms, they're not just being fought out in courts or Congress anymore. They're being addressed by massive popular action, millions of people taking to the streets.
It's a shift from purely institutional responses to direct popular ones.
Exactly. This movement, with its specific complaints and its global echo, it feels like a real stress test for American democracy, with the people themselves providing the response.
Which loops us back to that international dimension we talked about earlier.
Right.
Given that these protests weren't just here, they were global, in major world capitals, does that level of international dissent suggest that worries about authoritarian drift in the U.S. are now seriously impacting how the world sees American democracy?
And what could that mean down the line?
Yeah, how might that affect future diplomacy or trade relations or America's standing generally? That's the provocative question we'll leave you with today.